Learn Lakamora, Artoiv, good Shana Rabba, good Kvittel. Today's daf is actually the daf of Simchas Torah, daf Lamed Aleph. And this finishes this Pedic. We are up to the top of the page, so we learned the concept of pigul, which is if you shecht, or you do one of the four activities and you have in mind the wrong time, that will be eaten by you or by the Mizbeach, or that's called chutzlas mana. For that you get chorus, or chutzlas mekayma. You had in mind the wrong place, that you'll eat it in a place where you're not supposed to eat this particular carbon, and that's called chud. And there, it's a lav. The animal is disqualified, but you don't get chorus for that. So the Gemara now will have a series of questions with 3 lines from the top of the page of Lamed Aleph. Each one we learned. Chatzi zayis. Now remember, you have to have in mind a full kazayis, because that's the shear for eating. What happens if you had in mind a chatzi zayis chutzlas mana, half a zayis you had in mind but outside the time, chatzi zayis chutzlas mekayma, and a half a zayis outside the place, and the din there is that the animal is kosher, because a chatzi zayis is useless, and it's 2 separate avedas, 2 disparate avedas, they don't combine. But what happened here was the chatzi zayis chutzlas mana. Then you had in mind again, so you had in mind a half a zayis of chutzlas mana. Then you had a half a zayis of chutzlas mekayma, and then you had another half a zayis of chutzlas mana. The question is, does the last thought combine with the first thought and becomes now a full zayis, or do we say because in the interim you sandwiched in there between chutzlas mekayma, so the chutzlas mana combined with the chutzlas mekayma, you already removed it from the picture, and therefore the chutzlas mana that comes afterwards is something brand new and it doesn't combine. Omar Rava, so we have an argument. Rava says the Yaket Kiyoshan Hapigul. It reawakens when you have the second half of the Kazais of Chutzlas Mana. It joins the very first half, even though in between you had something in between. It didn't cancel, just nothing. And that's not the pshat is that it disappeared. It's still there, but nothing happened. Then when the second Chatzizai comes in, they combine. And Rabbi Nuna says, no, Eid of Machshavas Habi. It can't cancel. Since in the beginning there's a half a Zayis of Pigul and a half a Zayis of Mokum. They join together. And therefore you had it, and now it's another half. It's a brand new event, and all you have is half as ice. It doesn't reawaken, doesn't re-inspire, because it already disappeared. Amar said, how do I know? I'm going to compare it to the laws of Tumah. That now we learn by the laws of Tumah, you need the size of an egg of Tumah to contaminate others. To receive Tumah is a big malchek is Rishonim. Rashi holds to receive Tumah is sufficient, even the minutest amount of meat or food to receive the Tumah. And actually, one of the bases from this Gemara here, as we'll soon see, and Tosfos hold a bein time. There's no difference whether receiving tumah or transmitting tumah. You need the size of an egg. So what happened was kebeya oichel rishon. Now we know that when it comes to tumah, you have avi avaisa tumah. You have hierarchy. Ava tumah, then you have a rishon tumah. An ava tumah can contaminate pots and pans, can contaminate food, but a rishon tumah can only and people original tumah can only metame food makes a sheni, and that's the end of the line when it comes to ordinary things chulin. When it comes to truma, it goes to a shlishi. The very last stage is called puzzle, not even tummy, because it can't transmit any further. And by karbonis, it goes to revi. So says the Mishnah. Now we learned kebeya oichel rishon. There's a size of an egg of oichel, which was a rishon l'tumah. And so therefore whatever it touches becomes a sheni. And then you had another size of an egg, oichol sheni, that was a sheni that therefore would do nothing for chulin, but for trum would make it a shlishi. And what happened was you mix the two together. Rishon chalk is a rishon. So the status is like a rishon. Why is it treated like a rishon? If they touch something, now you have two bayas. It touch something, it's treated like a rishon touched it, because in there you have a full size of an egg of a rishon, even though it's mixed in with a sheni as well. But what happened if cholkun? You divide it into half, into 2 groups now. So each group has a mixture, and less than the size of an egg, the size of a rishon and a sheni. And then if they is that sheni, that's treated like a sheni. So they touch something, we always take the more lenient one, because they don't have a full egg of the more stricter one. So we always go for the common denominator, which is the more lenient one. The zeh sheni, they're both treated like a sheni. So now Rava says, "Oh, chazav ve'irva." What happens then? You remix them again. Rishon havi, they're elevated again to a rishon. So we see clearly that they don't get lost if it doesn't have that function, but if it's their potential when you can reawaken it. Says Gemara, "Memayin." How do I know that? Big Tony Sefer. It says in the next part of the Mishnah. What about Nafal? Let's say each one on their own. Let's say fell. In other words, first the first pile fell, and then you removed it, and then the second, the second side of an egg fell down, and kikar shatruma on a kikar of a truma. Remember, truma can go to shlishi. Pashlua, we treat it as if a sheni, because each one has a mixture of a chatz, has a half egg of rishon, half egg of sheni. So and since they all landed on the truma separately, we treat it as if they're a sheni, and the truma comes a shlishi, comes pasul. What if naflu shnei and ka'achas, if both the size of an egg fell at the same time? So between the two of them, you definitely have the size of an egg of a rishon. Then we are elevated the status of this trumeya to be a sheni, also a shnia. So we see clearly that you reawaken it. But Amununa says, what are you talking about? How do you compare that to our case? You know why? Over there, you started out with a full egg of rishon. So you already had the rishon, it was established as a rishon. And then you broke it up, and then you put it back. Of course it reawakens, it never disappeared. Our case, it never was built up in the first place. Our case, you start out with a half a zayis of chutz l'zman and a half a zayis chutz l'mekayim. Then you have another half a zayis. You never established that it's a full zayis. So therefore, it disappears. No, the real question is, how do we treat a small amount? The din is a chatzishir osam in the Torah, Rabbi Yochanan. That is, the din is, let's say, kazayis is an is in the Torah, and half a kazayis is also osam in the Torah. But how do we understand that half a zayis is osam in the Torah? There's two ways of understanding it, as the Neighbor Yehuda says, and others argue and everything else. One way of understanding it is it's like a gzeira. Really, if it's less than a kazayis, there's no aveira here. But the Torah said if you can eat a half a kazayis, we're scared you can eat another half a kazayis within a certain period of time. Kedei achilas pras, the time it takes to eat a half a loaf of bread, within any time between 3 and 11 minutes, and therefore we are going to treat it as if it's awesome HaTorah. That's one way. It's Xera. But really, intrinsically, it's not awesome. The other opinion says, no. The fact that a full size is awesome, that means that every minute part has an Isser in it. Just what? The Torah says you don't get punished for it until it's a Kazayis. So Chatashir Bet, and that's the thing here. So Rav Nuna said, how can you compare half a Zayis? There's nothing here at all. But because he learns that a half a Zayis, less than the shir, is 0. So that's why you're trying to establish something. But the Rabbi learned that a half a zayis is no different than a full zayis. The Isser is there. Just you don't get punished and all that. It doesn't have certain abilities to functions. But the Isser is there, so there's no difference having a half a zayis or the full beya. And if over there we can reawaken it, so too here. That's the argument, possibly. Anyway, how do I know that it does not reawaken? It's not. We learned if you have food that became tummy avatumah, then you have other food that became tummy through a vlada tumah, that through a rishon is mitzdarfin. So they both combine litame bekal that you give, and the common denominator, the lowest level, that's the tumah status that of this particular mixture. Shebishnei, my love, and it seems to me it's always that way. I forgot the hadamal. Even if you bring more of the original to now make it a full share, it doesn't reawaken it. Said, that's not a proof. The Mishnah talking about you didn't bring more to reawaken it. So it doesn't prove one way or another. The Gemara continues. Ravdimi came along. Amar, he said, if you had a half a zayis outside of this place, half a zayis outside of its time, then you had another half a zayis outside of time. We're going to learn a brisa from Bar Kapara. We're going to have interesting 3 different views as to what Kapara said. So according to Rav Dimi, in this case here, the first half of zayis was chutz l'mekayim, and then the next thought was a half of zayis chutz l'zmanai, and then you had another half of zayis chutz l'zmanai. So you really had 2 chatzah zayis and chutz l'zmanai together, but you started out first with a chatzi zayis of chutz l'mekayim. So he says here. He says in this case, Bar Kapara says pigul, because the 2 half a zaysim are next to each other of chutz l'zmanai, the second and third thought, so they combine. And we don't say that the first half of zayis of chutz l'mekayim joins the second half of zayis of zmanai, and they combine together, and they disappear. So therefore, when you have the second thought of chatzi shir for the chutz l'zmanai, it's something brand new. That we don't say. In this case, because they were next to each other, they combine. So sort of a little bit like rubber that they reawakens, but here it's like because they're contiguous to each other. However, Ravi came along. He said, "No, bigger chiddush." Amar, he said, "The chatzi zayis chutz l'zmanai. The first half of zayis was outside the time. The chatzi zayis chutz l'zmanai. The second half was chutz l'zmanai. The chatzi l'zmanai. The third one chutz l'mekayim. That's when Tani Bar Kapara. No, in your case, and maybe it's not pigul. Maybe the first half of kazai is chutz l'mekayim and the second half of kazai is chutz l'man, they join together and they disappear. And then the third thought that you had chutz l'man is a brand new thought. You know when Kapara says that they join, the first half of zayis was chutz l'man, the second half of zayis chutz l'man, and then the third one was chutz l'mekayim. And we say that the second and third don't join. It's the second and the first that join. And you have a full share. That third thought doesn't interfere at all with what's happening here. It becomes pigul. Ravashi masnahacha. Ravashi learns the following in Bar Kapara. Chatzi zayis chutz l'zmani. He had half a chutz. And then what you do, this is a bigger chiddush, because zayis, then you had a full zayis, and you thought within that zayis, so you would have thought, wow, you had one thought for a kazayis, and in that one thought you broke it up into a half chutz l'mekayim and a half chutz l'mani. So maybe since that's less than the share, that should disappear. He says no. Since at the end of the day you have the initial thought was chutz l'mani, and now including that second thought was also chutz l'mani. They join forces, and now you have a full kazayis chutz l'mani. Pigel. The chatzi zayis of chutz l'mekayim cannot stand up against these two. Rabbi Yana said, Chishav, let's say you thought sheyechlu klabim. This is what you thought. You thought I'm going to have that this kazayis of this animal will be eaten not by a person outside of the time, but by an animal. Is that considered eating? Pigel is considered pigel. Now, why? Because we find the expression eating. It says by Yezebel, just a wicked woman, that her ultimate punishment will be that that the dogs will consume her flesh after she dies. So we find the word achila. So therefore, in that by a pigul, it says the word here, achal yachal, eating. So therefore, it's considered pigul. Maskor Rabami says, if by you, just the word eating alone is enough to make it pigul. So what about ma'at chishav? Let's say you thought shetachlu eish, that no human or no living thing will eat it, but the fire will eat it. What happens then? Could we find by fire also the word that fire consumes? Sometimes we use the word eish as well. What happens is I think, tomorrow I'm going to put it on the barbecue in my backyard and I'll roast it on the fire. Maybe it should be pigul. And where do you find the word eating by fire? The Chsiv says, Teichlu eish lo neifach, that a fire should eat, it'll never blow out. That wasn't blown. Hachanami the pigul. Maybe it is. But it says in our Mishnah, if somebody had a mind to eat, you had a mind to eat a half a kazayis for yourself, and the other half a kazayis, the mizbeach will eat, and you had it in mind to the wrong place, we say the two cannot combine. Chatzizais kosher, it's kosher. You know why it's kosher? Because it's two different kinds of consumption. So l'chayda, if I had in mind my backyard, it's totally different. It's not normal eating. Eat. So what answers? I don't understand your problem. If he would have said the mizbeach should eat half a kazayis and I will have a kazayis, they would have combined because they're both eating. You said it should be roasted on the mizbeach half a kazayis, and then you said and the half a kazayis I should eat. So it's not just two different activities. I didn't discuss. I treated the mizbeach activity as roasting, not as eating. Therefore, they don't combine. The words are so important that they don't combine. But about the question, what about chishav lecha kazayis b'shnei b'nadim? I thought I'll eat a kazayis animal will be eaten outside the base of Mikdash or outside the right time, but by two different people. So each person eating a half a kazayis, but the thought was for a full kazayis. How do we deal with that? Do we say basa machshavas lin? We look at the machshava, and therefore it's a full kazayis. Lika shiura, or you basa oichlin, the people consuming it, well, like a shiura. There's no shir. Oh, by Tashba coming here, if he said in the Mishnah, same Mishnah, it says lecha. If I had in mind, and we're going to make deductions or inferences, kechatzi zayis, I had in mind to eat a half a zayis. Ulahaktika, half a kazayis should go on the mizbech, and we say kosher, they don't combine. Eating and roasting on the mizbech, they don't combine. But what about if he says eating and eating? In a similar fashion as eating and roasting, but I use the word eating and eating, or then do me the lechel in a case which is similar to lechel hakta, which is like two different activities, but if I use the word eating, it would combine. For example, I said a half a kazai will be eaten by person A, and a half a kazai will be eaten by person B, and mistadav, it combines. Shema doesn't have to prove that what? That answers the question that they do combine. Because they're both talking about eating, so it's one thought. Well, Rav has a question. What about Chishul Lech Gizai? He had a mind to eat a Gizai, but normally a person, when we say you have to eat matzah on Pesach, it has to be Kedei Achilles Pras. When you do an Avera treif, it has to be Kedei Achilles Pras. So what happens? We're just starting a new questions here. We're in Daf Lamed Aleph on the very top of the page, and basically we're continuing about Pigel, and we have just a series of questions that if you, instead of doing a full kazayis, you broke it up into a half a kazayis of this. Our Mishnah breaks it up. If you did a half a kazayis of chutzlas man and half a kazayis, it's usher, but there's no chorus involved over here. So the Lamed Aleph on the top of the page. So we're asking the following question. What the first question was, which we just learned a minute ago, starting Lamed Aleph, where if you had in mind one kazayis, but to be eaten by two people. So do we say you look at the people, each was a half a kazayis, or do we say, but I thought about a full kazayis? So Abaye solved the question because the Mishnah says that if you had in mind a half a kazayis roasting on the mizbeach and half a kazayis the people who are eating, they don't combine. Vice is because you said roasting and eating. But if I would have said eating and eating, it would have combined, like the mizbeach and a person, two different places. So the marshal, two people eating it. So they're both doing the same activity, both eating, but two different. Then that's kosher. Only a mizbeach and the person are treated like two different activities. So here's the question. You said you lead a kazayis of this animal outside the right place at the wrong time, but it should take me longer than kedei achilas pras. Kedei achilas pras is the time it takes to eat a half a loaf of bread. Big machlek is the Rambam and Rashi, whether it's it's 4 eggs or 3 eggs. What are we talking about here? The amount of time, and within that there's a machlekes in the achronim. How much time that is. The minimum is 3 minutes, and it goes up to 11 minutes. I think some sefer says 7, the Zevachim Daf says 9 that he heard from the Rebbe. And obviously we're generally machmer. So when it comes to matzah and Pesach, we're machmer to try to eat it to be yitzhak, to fulfill all the opinions. So we eat it within 3 minutes, the kazayis or the 2 kazayisim. And when it comes to Yom Kippur, we're machmer. We try to stretch it out if possible to beyond 11 minutes or at least beyond 9 minutes if we can. So what happens? You had in mind what's the shayla then? If you can eat a kazayis beyond achilas pras, then what's the shayla? There's one Rashi somewhere, I can't remember where Rashi, generally achilas pras includes the eating as well, but there's one Rashi somewhere it's between the two eatings, the time that you don't eat between the two. If it's longer than achilas pras, then that eating activity is not part of that time period achilas pras. It's a little bit in the lashon Rashi here, but not so clear. So what I just said. So Rabbi asked, you had to eat my kazayis longer than achilas pras. What's the question? Do we compare it? Remember, because there's either you had in mind that you should roast it on mizbeach, or you had in mind that a person should eat it. Roasting on mizbeach, there's no time limit. You put it on mizbeach. Who knows how long? Depends if it lands in the middle of the fire, lands on the fringe of the fire, how long it takes to burn. But there's no laws there. But when it comes to a person eating, we have laws. So who do we compare it to when we say that a kazai is pigul? Do we say la'achilas gavaya compared to achilas gavaya? And therefore, there's no time period where one has to do. Look at a person. Now, the easiest answer would have been, well, it depends which one you're doing. If I had in mind, if I said that I should roast a mizbeach, the wrong time, so then it doesn't matter. Even if you had in mind long enough achilas pras, who cares? Because mizbeach doesn't care. If I had in mind for a person eating and I had in mind why don't we divide that? But because we learned both isurim from the same word in the same pasuk, we can't break it up into 2 time periods. There has to be 1 time period. The question is, which is the main? I want to buy a Toshma. Let's again back to the same line in the Mishnah. It says in the Mishnah, Lecho kechatz I'll eat half a zayis or lahakti chazayis, not put on the half a zayis the wrong time, wrong place. Kosher, they don't combine, and it's kosher. Why? She'ein achila v'haktarim is type. 2 different activities, they don't combine. And the wording is different. Time the lecho lahakti is only because it said eating and roasting. If I said I'll eat and I'll eat, even though mitzvah combines. And we said before, even when I said eating on the mizbeach and eating a person, they combine because they're both talking about eating. How long does it take to eat on the mizbeach? It takes a long time for fire to burn it. So we see clearly from here that that they combine. In other words, even if it's more chil pras, it still combines. It doesn't matter. There's no limit of the time. Said you might have noted. Maybe the Mishnah talking about there's a big fire on the mizbeach and it takes 2 minutes to burn the whole thing. So it doesn't prove one way or another. Telling about a further time, the whole reason is the lech or lahakti. He said, I will eat, a person will eat, or I will eat, and on the mizbeach will go, what about it will be consumed, but something that belongs on the mizbeach? Well, I will eat the fats outside the time. So we'll learn before there's a machlekes tanaim. Chacham to say, as the Mishnah clearly said before, that only things which are common for meat to eat the meat, or from mizbeach to eat the fats. I can't say I will eat the fats; it's meaningless. But Ablezer says in all cases it's possible. But it seems in the Mishnah here, and we decided that our Mishnah is either one part of it is a Chacham, the first Mishnah is Rabbi Lezer, the second one Chachamim, or all of it is a Chachamim. Then now time of the lechel will haktir ho lechel lechel. Let's infer. What about if I said I'll eat what's on the mizbech? Then you would be chayiv. Davar sheidak lechel mistadif. No, it goes according to Rabbi Lezer. And the problem is in the Mishnah, in the beginning, that Mishnah it says, lechel, to eat, only eshedak lechel, things which people normally eat. Eshedak lechel, if I say I'm going to eat the fats that belong in Mizbech, I will eat it outside Yerushalayim or outside the Beis Hamikdash, it doesn't count. Yes, this last part of the Mishnah follows Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that anything is called eating. He said they transferred. It's not. Where do we see this opinion? Where does this Rabbi Eliezer? We already had it before as well. Now we learned. He shech the carbon, and he had in mind, you will eat you'll eat something, the fats, which don't belong to people, go to the Mizbeach. Or you had in mind, the meat that you're supposed to eat, you say, you know what, I'll put it on Mizbeach. The Chacham say kosher. It's not a machshava. It doesn't count. It's nothing. However, Rabbi Lezer passes. Rabbi Lezer passes because he says, I don't care as long as it's being consumed, it's eating, it's considered pigul. So the last part of the Mishnah is Rabbi Lezer, and the middle part of the Mishnah is the Rabbanan, and the first part of the Mishnah is Rabbi Lezer as well, according to one opinion before. Abai says, I feel tame Rabbanan. No, I can say it's the Rabbanan. This beginning of the second half of the Mishnah was Rabbanan. It should flow through. But make a different inference. Well, don't infer you decided only eating and haktarah. But if I said eating and eating dover she'ain darker lechel, if I will eat part or eating something which is not common to eat, like fats that belong in the zebech, who told you to make that inference? The lema say lechel v'lechel dover she'darker lechel. But if I had in mind to eat something which I'll eat because I have meat and have whatever something else, things which are common to eat, then I'm chayiv. But what am I coming? That what? No, I had in mind to eat a half a kazayis of meat and another half a kazayis of meat. They combined, and I'm chayiv. What's the kiddush? That they combine. We already know that from the first part of Mishnah. If you're trying to tell me what things which are normally eat, even though I had in mind only a half a kazayis, but because I had in mind a half kazayis and then another half a kazayis, they combine. But we already know that from the beginning. It says they kechatzi zayis b'chutz. If you had in mind a half a zayis outside and kechatzi zayis mocha half a kazayis tomorrow, then it's possible you don't get cars. Why? Because it's two different things. Mashma, but if I thought the same thing, but a half a kazayis, you'll combine. Yep. Is an ilech if the chiddush is that what? But if you had that just very din, that's the din to tell you that if you had in mind a half a kazayis you can eat and a half a kazayis from the mizbeach, they don't combine. Even though they're both chutzes manoi, they're both chutzes mekayim, they don't combine. That's the chiddush to tell you pasha this din, no inference. This is the halacha. Ilech like beduk the reisha shmam. I already know it from the diak and the reisha. It says there lechel davar shedak to lechel in she'ain dak lechel. That's only chayiv. The Rabbanan say if you have in mind things that you normally eat. So if I have in mind half a kazayis what I'm going to eat and half of the mizbeach will eat, since I don't eat it, they don't combine. Is hashta, and I would say even and Nachman, and we're talking about me. That what if I had in mind half a kazayis I'll eat meat and half a kazayis I'll eat fats that belong in the mizbeach, they don't combine. So surely if I had in mind a half a kazayis of meat I will eat and a half a kazayis I will put on the mizbeach, surely they don't combine. Have nothing to do with it. So what do I need this halacha for? I'm talking about my consumption. I'm going to eat. Half a kazayis of normal food. I won't combine. You have to tell me the eating and makti and boya. Moshe said, no, yes, you do. You need it for this very halacha. That you don't combine a half a kazayis of my eating and a half a kazayis of zbech. Why? Can't you learn from the other? No. Because I thought over there it's not normal. For me to eat the fats of zbech is not normal. But what am I saying over here? I will eat the half a kazayis of meat that belongs to me, and the mizbech will eat the half a kazayis of meat that belongs to the mizbech. That's normal. These are both normal activities. I would have thought that maybe the half a kazayis and they're both chutzes mani, they should combine. Not thinking, each one the normal way. They don't combine. This finishes the second parak, and Thursday morning we're back to normal time.